In this video, I'll show you in great detail the whole process of swapping the housing of a PSP 3000. This one's gonna be long and boring, and by the time this is over, you're probably gonna be sick of my voice. However, I believe the information I'm gonna be presenting to you here is gonna be invaluable if you decide to take this up yourself. So let's get started.
Before we start, I just want to point out some important notes I collected while I was editing the video. Firstly, watch the video. No, seriously, just watch the whole thing. Swapping housings on PSPs is a nightmare due to the aftermarket housing issues, so it will be good if you know what you'll have to face. Secondly, you need a lot of patience for this. I've done housing replacements like this many times and I still screw things up, so take it slow. Thirdly, it's not gonna be perfect. It doesn't matter how much effort you put into it, the quality of the aftermarket housings will never match the stuff that came originally from the factory. And lastly, try to reuse original parts wherever possible, especially the buttons. The aftermarket ones usually feel weird if you can get them to work at all. Now, if you're following this as a guide, I would highly suggest you test absolutely everything before you start dismantling your PlayStation. The reason being is that if you break something, you have no way of knowing whether it was working to begin with. Here in this clip, I go pretty much through all of the peripherals on the PlayStation. I check the buttons, the Wi-Fi, the memory stick, the sound, as well as the UMD drive, and make sure that everything works before I start disassembling it. You can find a link to the testing software that I'm using down in the video description below, but keep in mind that you need to have custom firmware for it to work. Start off by removing the battery cover and the battery. Afterwards, remove the sticker on the bottom of the battery compartment. Once that's done, remove the 4 screws on the back, 1 on the bottom, and 2 on the top. Take care not to misplace the screws. It's easy to just use some small magnets to keep them all in a bundle. Additionally, if you're struggling to get the screws out, you can use magnets to make the tip of your screwdriver magnetic too. All you need to do is to swipe the magnet across the screwdriver towards the tip like so, many times. After getting all the screws out, the front faceplate can now be popped off, but be careful. There's this foam lining which tends to stick to the front. Make sure not to rip it apart. The job of this foam piece is to prevent dust entering between the LCD and the clear element on the faceplate. The home button row can now be unclipped from the sides. Take out the metal spacer from the upper part of the LCD. Afterwards, gently lift the screen and you will see 2 flex cables connecting it to the motherboard. Both cables are released by opening up the grey plastic locking tabs on the connectors. Wiggle the screen left and right to remove the cables and the screen itself. The home button row and the microphone are removed the same way as the screen. Just pop the connector locking tabs and wiggle while pulling softly. Remove the 7 highlighted screws. At the same time, remove the shoulder button retainers and the buttons themselves. My suggestion is to keep all the parts in a container to not lose anything. Now that the screws have been removed, you can take out the power switch PCB. As before, unlock the flex cable connector by opening the locking tab upwards. Remove the PCB and place it to the side. To remove the charging port, simply move the plastic retainer clip, which will then let you pull the charging port upwards. Use the sharp point of the tweezers to help you remove the charging port cable. The speaker can then be popped out with a gentle pry. To remove the action button ribbon, disconnect it from the motherboard. Note that it's glued to the housing, so carefully pry it upwards while trying not to significantly bend or flex it. Now disconnect the Wi-Fi cable by putting your tweezers right under the cable next to the connector socket and pulling the plug outwards. Take out the analog stick to the side. Loosen up the D-pad assembly by prying it up slightly with your tweezers and disconnect the flex cable. Remove the entire assembly and carefully unstick the left shoulder button ribbon from the housing. And now disconnect and remove the analog stick. To free the motherboard, the silver trim on the bottom must come out first. It's quite easy to take out. You can use your nails to safely pry the pieces upwards. Now remove the two flex cables that connect to the UMD drive. The bottom one can be removed the same way as the other ones so far. And the white flex cable on the right can be removed by pushing on the sides of the brown retainer. To remove the motherboard, lift it up at an angle like so, and then just wiggle it until it comes out. Remove the little metal shield that's held in place by a single screw. Now remove the UMD door spring retainer, and pull out the spring. You can open and close the door a few times to make the spring come out by itself. And there it is. There are two tiny rubber stoppers that prevent the metal UMD door frame from popping out of the hinges. They need to come out next. Once the rubber stoppers are out, the metal frame can be removed from the hinges by simply pushing it away from the hinge pins. Move the frame down towards the bottom of the UMD drive and it should pop out from its rails. The UMD door is attached to the rest of the housing on both sides. To remove the door, first unhinge this side by prying the door away from the housing. Starting with the other side will not work well, as that's where the extra protrusions for the door spring are. Once this side is loose, the entire door can be taken out pretty easily. Next we need to remove the Wi-Fi antenna. Remove the remaining sticker from the battery compartment, and then unstick the antenna from the housing by inserting your tweezers under the antenna and peeling it off. Remove the following 4 screws, then pry the UMD drive upwards until it comes out. Make sure not to lose any of these 4 rubber bushings. Now that that's done, spin the PSP around and start removing the UMD door retainer. Pry it out gently using tweezers, and then fish out the retainer spring. All that's left now is to remove the 2 screw mounts and the silver trim from the top. Pry off the silver trim, and then pull out the screw mounts with your tweezers. And that is pretty much it for the old shell. Most of the important parts have now been removed. So let's inspect the new shell and see if anything should be reused. Let's start by inspecting the buttons. A quick note though, try and keep the shell protector for as long as you can to prevent damage while handling. Now if you take a close look at the original buttons here, you can see that the material is molded very nicely. It is stiff, even, and the edges are sharp. Compared to the aftermarket ones, however, I immediately run into our first quality failure. One of the buttons has fallen off the rubber and stayed in the faceplate, so that already tells you quite a lot about the kind of quality we're dealing with here. Now in general, I would suggest reusing the old buttons if you don't mind the different color, as the quality of the aftermarket ones is usually crap. But don't take my word for it. Hey, you might be more lucky than me, so try your new ones out. The shoulder buttons are usually also of dubious quality. They tend to have molding problems, particularly around extruding parts that are meant for holding the button in place. I had good success previously by sanding or filing down the imperfections, so you can try doing that if yours are in really bad shape. In this case, however, I will be reusing the old ones, because they still seem to be in excellent condition and are sure to work better than the aftermarket ones. The aftermarket housing kits usually include some fake stickers and a full, but sadly low quality screw set. Use the stickers at your discretion, but I don't recommend using the included screws. They're low quality and tend to break, so avoid using them unless you absolutely have to. The side trim is also usually poorly molded, but in this case, apart from a slightly different paint shade, the trim seems to be manufactured spot on. Do note, however, that your mileage may vary, as I've seen significant variations in the quality of these things. Now here's the analog stick cover. Usually there's nothing wrong with these, But the memory stick cover, or at least the rubber part of it, leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, it looks like it's rubber, but it acts more like cardboard. There's just no way we're going to be using this. Now it's time to start the reassembly. Ensure you have a clean work area and try to keep the protective film on the bottom part of the housing intact. This will help you prevent scratching the new housing while you work. A neat trick here is to use a paper knife and carefully cut along the UMD door edges to separate the protective film into 3 parts. Note how the silver UMD door ring managed to peel itself off together with the protective film while I was trying to get it loose. Plenty of small things like this tend to go wrong due to the shady quality, so do keep in mind that replacing a PSP housing almost never goes smoothly. The next steps are to remove the UMD door, which pops out quite easily with a bit of force, and the battery cover, followed by reassembling the UMD door retainer. The screw mounts are the first to go back in. When inserting, make sure that the bent part points towards the bottom of the PSP. Take your time, as the tolerances are not great in the aftermarket housing. Be gentle and be careful not to break anything. If you feel that you're using a lot of force to insert something, it's likely that you're doing it wrong. The sliding retainer mechanism goes in next. Start off by inserting back the spring. Place one end of the spring on the protrusion so it sits like so. Place the hook of the sliding part onto the spring, and then push the assembly in until it clicks into place. Make sure it is in correctly by pushing the slider towards the right side. Upon letting go, it should immediately spring back into place. Now it's time to replace the UMD drive. Reuse the old screws if possible. Make sure to get the ribbon cables out correctly to the other side. Carefully align the rubber spacers on the drive with the protruding pins on the housing. Double check that none of the rubber spacers are missing and that the ribbon cables have gone through correctly to the other side, then screw down the drive using the 4 screws. Now take the Wi-Fi antenna and remove the old glue. First, get rid of the bigger chunks, and then finish up cleaning using a rag and some lighter fluid. Lighter fluid is basically gasoline, which dissolves most kinds of glue like magic. Cut a small piece of double-sided sticky tape and position it on the antenna. Remove the tape backing material and make sure that the tape has an even and flat surface. Lastly, insert the antenna through the other side and stick it to the housing. To reassemble the UMD drive door, position the metal frame so that the flat surface faces away from the UMD door and that the longer parts point downwards. On each side of the UMD door, there are guide rails for the metal frame. Each rail has a wider opening on the bottom. Insert the pair of the metal frame pins through the openings in the rail and pull the frame upwards. Hold the frame against the UMD door for it not to fall out, and then push the door into the housing while still holding the metal frame. Use tweezers to insert the upper pair of pins into the holes that are on the top of the UMD drive. Replace the rubber stoppers to prevent the door frame pins popping out, and then test the door to make sure it opens and closes correctly. It is normal for the door to feel loose at this point, as we'll still need to replace the UMD door spring. Let's install the UMD door spring and the spring retainer. To install the UMD door spring, first slide the shorter bent end of the spring into the protrusion with a hole in the case, like so. Afterwards, while aiming the longer end towards the hole on the UMD door, wiggle and push the spring forward until it stops. Try opening and closing the UMD door to see if the spring is set correctly, and then insert the spring retainer to keep it in place. A small metal shielding part must be installed next. Secure it with a screw as shown here. Now we need to put the analog stick back in place. Don't forget to swap in the new analog nub too. Simply pull off the old nub from the base, then snap the new one back in. Place the analog stick back in its position and secure it with a screw. Next to go in is the motherboard, but before it's put back, the silver trim that's on the bottom needs to be removed. To install the motherboard, position it at an angle like so. Insert the USB port into its location, but don't fully seat the motherboard in just yet. While the motherboard is still loose, use tweezers to pull out the 3 flex cables from under the motherboard. Once the flex cables are out, push the motherboard down fully and ensure it's laying down perfectly flat. After the motherboard is in, replace the silver trim pieces, starting with the one on the right side. Reconnect the 2 flex cables from the UMD drive and one from the analog stick. To reconnect the large UMD flex cable, make sure the brown retainer is fully out. Slide the cable in and push the retainer inwards by the sides. For the remaining cables, make sure the locking tabs are upwards, then insert the cables into the connectors as far as they will go and push the locking tabs down. Now before we continue, we need to take care of the new memory stick cover. More accurately, this pathetic excuse of a rubber retainer has to go. The plan is to remove the rubber retainer from the old cover piece, get rid of the new one, and then graft the old rubber retainer back on the new cover. To get started, we need to remove the old cover from the D-pad assembly. Plastic pins prevent the retainer from falling out. To remove the cover, bend the rubber parts upwards and over the pins, and the cover should slide out. To remove this junk rubber retainer from the new cover, carefully pull the rubber upwards and away from the plastic pins, but make sure not to break the pins. As for the good retainer, release it from the old cover piece by using a paper knife to cut off the plastic pins. The next step is to stick the old rubber retainer to the new cover piece. The best way to do this is using a soldering iron, which I will demonstrate here. I do realize most people watching will probably not have a soldering iron, so an alternative is to heat a thin screwdriver with the stove or with a lighter. Most importantly, I do not recommend you use glue or epoxy, as it may not fit well afterwards. To put the pieces back together, join the old rubber retainer to the new cover and ensure everything fits correctly. The task now is to use the soldering iron to melt the tops of the plastic pins against the rubber retainer. This will keep the rubber retainer tightly attached to the cover. Press and hold the rubber retainer firmly against the cover next to the pin. Here you can see me melting down one of the pins in real time. As you can see, the plastic is very quick to melt, so take care. Do the same for all the remaining pins. Once you're finished, don't forget to inspect the results closely to make sure the rubber retainer is on securely, and then attach the new memory stick cover to the D-pad assembly. Reconnect the D-pad cable and place the D-pad assembly back into position. Check to see that the memory stick cover still moves freely. Now connect the power switch PCB to the action button ribbon. Then reconnect the assembly to the motherboard, and make sure that the ribbon sticks well to the housing by massaging it down with your finger. Snap the power switch PCB into place, then screw it down. Now is a good time to do a quick test. Here I'm connecting back the screen and plugging in the charger to see if the PSP turns on correctly. After the PSP turns on, I check that the buttons are working too. I'm also testing the UMD drive. Note that since the motherboard is not screwed down, the UMD disk detection switch may not be fully depressed, so I'm holding the motherboard down with the plastic end of my screwdriver. Once everything's been tested, disconnect the power adapter and the screen, and close the ribbon cable connectors. The power socket can now go back in place. Insert it under the power switch flex cable and screw it down. Something that I forgot to do that is very important here is to insert the power socket wires under this plastic retainer, so I had to go back and fix it. The wires must be secured under the retainer, otherwise they will squeeze the screen so that when you reassemble everything back you will see a dark spot on the display. That is how I knew I missed something. Thankfully, no permanent damage was done. As you can see here, the dark spot problem is no longer apparent. Back to where we left off, the Wi-Fi antenna wire needs to be connected. Place the Wi-Fi cable under the right shoulder button ribbon cable and position it in the gap between the housing and the motherboard. Stick the shoulder button ribbon down against the housing. To connect the cable, center the connector and push it down. Stick the left shoulder button ribbon against the housing. Replace both shoulder buttons and their plastic retainers, then screw them down. To put the speaker back, insert the plastic tab that's on the top of the speaker under this plastic retainer. Then, place the other tab under this clip. Grab the clip and position it over the speaker's plastic tab. Here's how it's supposed to look when finished. Reconnect the home button array assembly. Then move it out of the way and reconnect the screen. Position the screen flat and push the home button array down until it clicks into place. The rubber cover for the speaker usually sticks to the action button membrane, so take it off. Slightly lift the screen and position the rubber speaker cover like so. Last thing to do here is to drop the metal spacer for the screen back in place. And now we're done with the bottom part of the reassembly. At this point, it was time for me to start reassembling the buttons into the faceplate and wrap up the rehousing process. But the shoddy quality of the replacement housing held me back yet again. As I started handling the faceplate, I noticed that the clear screen section was not glued to the rest of the faceplate properly, and it came apart in my hands. As my intention is to show you that these quality issues are not impossible to deal with, I will give you a brief overview on how I glued the pieces back together. To glue the screen section, I chose to use the 5-minute Gorilla epoxy, as on the label it is said that it dries clear. To prepare for gluing, snip off a fresh section of your paper knife and carefully cut the faceplate protector along the edges of the screen section, then remove the screen section out. Practice test fitting the screen a couple of times to prepare for gluing. Once ready, mix the epoxy on a non-porous surface like this plastic-coated packaging. Do not mix on paper or cardboard as the components may soak into the paper and mess with the ratio. Once mixed thoroughly, apply the glue by small droplets onto the edges of the faceplate. Don't use a lot of glue. Full coverage is not necessary here, and it's better to use less to prevent squeeze out. Place the screen into the faceplate frame and press it down tightly. Immediately inspect both sides and wipe off any glue that squeezes out. Having the screen protector still intact here helps to make sure no glue ends up on the faceplate or the screen. Once in place, put the glued faceplate on a piece of paper, then use something hard as a backing and clamp everything down. I decided to leave the epoxy to fully set overnight just in case. Back next day, I have inspected the results and was happy that no glue has seeped out. You can't really tell this was a fix, as these pieces are also glued at the factory in a similar way. Now that the faceplate is fixed, it's time to put the buttons back in and do a test fit. Start off by trimming the edges of the internal screen protector so that it doesn't interfere with the buttons. Place the D-pad and the D-pad rubber membrane, as well as the action buttons, back into the faceplate. To keep the home row buttons in place, put some sticky tape on the front of the faceplate, then insert the buttons from the other side and ensure they stick to the tape. This will prevent them from falling out when putting the faceplate back. Now to test fit the faceplate, don't fully push it down. First, align it with the rest of the housing and check the right side to make sure this plastic clip goes into the bottom part correctly, as it can snap off very easily if not aligned properly. After putting the faceplate on, retest everything. Make sure everything works before moving on, because removing the faceplate again after the internal screen protector has been peeled off increases the chances of getting dust stuck under the screen. Remove the faceplate and clean the screen until it's absolutely spotless and free of any specks of dust. A soft brush is handy here to get rid of any stray dust particles. Don't forget to replace the microphone cap, as it tends to fall off. Prepare a clean place to lay the faceplate down on your workspace and clean the internal side of the faceplate from any dust. Double check that the screen is spotless and wipe it again if necessary. Remove the internal screen protector from the faceplate and immediately lay the faceplate down on the clean surface. Dust the screen one final time, just in case. Quickly place and align the faceplate down onto the housing. Start screwing back the external screws as shown here. Once you have at least a couple screws in, pat yourself on the back. The worst part is now over, and hopefully no dust managed to sneak in between the screen and the faceplate. Finish screwing in the last screws. I decided to go ahead and use the new stickers for this rehousing to give it a more OEM look. Additionally, I had to unstick and realign the UMD door ring as it got out of place in the beginning of the reassembly. After removing the sticky tape used to hold the home button array in place, clean off any residue. The last thing to do now is to remove the outside screen protector and inspect the results. As you can see, the screen is spotless and no dust is visible internally, besides this bit that already managed to land on the screen right after peeling off the protector. And that is it. If you made it this far, congratulations.
So there you go, that's the whole process of swapping the housing of a PSP 3000. If you followed this video as a guide, let me know how well it worked for you. If you've watched the video and now you're undecided on whether you want to try it or not, I say go for it. The results are very rewarding. Anyway, I hope it was useful, and I'll see you again soon.